The courtroom was silent, thick with tension, the kind that made the air feel heavy. A woman stood firm, her dark skin glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights, her eyes locked onto the officer before her. She had done nothing wrong. Nothing to deserve this. But that didn't matter. Not in a world where a badge could mean power unchecked. The officer, tall and smug in his uniform, had a smirk curling at the edge of his lips. The arrogance was unmistakable, the look of a man who had played this game too many times and never lost. He scanned the room with the ease of someone who knew he had the upper hand. And then, his hand went to his taser. "You think you can walk in here and talk down to me?" His voice dripped with disdain, cutting through the silence like a blade. The woman didn't flinch. "I'm here because justice has to be served." He scoffed, shaking his head. "Justice?" The way he spat the word made it sound like a joke. "Justice is what I say it is." And then, without warning, without hesitation, without an ounce of justification, he pulled the trigger on the taser. The crackling surge of electricity filled the air as the metal prongs shot forward, latching onto her skin. The shock coursed through her body, her muscles locking, her breath seizing in her throat. She collapsed, her body slamming against the cold courtroom floor, her dignity stripped away in an instant. Gasps erupted around the room. A judge's gavel slammed down, but the damage had been done. The officer stood over her, his smirk widening into something even darker, something more sinister. "Know your place," he muttered, his voice just low enough for her to hear. She could feel the burn on her skin, but the pain was nothing compared to the humiliation. The helplessness. The sheer injustice of it all. And yet, as she lay there, something burned even hotter inside her. Rage. A fire ignited in her chest, white-hot and unwavering. The kind of fire that didn't burn out, it only grew stronger. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her breath heavy but controlled. She lifted her head, locking eyes with the man who thought he had just won. And then, she said two words that changed everything. "I'm FBI." The smirk on his face didn't just fade, it shattered. His whole body stiffened, his mind scrambling to process what he had just done. The murmurs in the courtroom turned into a low roar. Whispers of disbelief, of shock, of horror. The judge, frozen for a moment, finally found his voice. "What did you just say?" She pushed herself fully upright, her eyes never leaving the officers. "I said, I'm with the FBI. And you just made the biggest mistake of your life." The officer stumbled back half a step, the color draining from his face. The room shifted, the balance of power tilting in an instant. His arrogance, his certainty, gone. Panic clawed at his throat, his hands twitching at his sides. The realization was sinking in fast. "You." He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "You're lying." She tilted her head, the slightest smirk creeping onto her lips now. "Am I?" For the first time, the officer looked uncertain. And then, the doors to the courtroom burst open. A flood of agents in dark suits poured in, their movements swift and precise, their expressions unreadable. The lead agent stepped forward, flashing a badge that made the blood drain even further from the officer's face. "You're under investigation," the agent said, his voice firm. "And as of this moment, you are suspended from duty." The officer's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The room was spinning, his world crumbling faster than he could comprehend. His entire career, his life, the power he wielded so carelessly, it was slipping through his fingers like sand. And as he stood there, drowning in the weight of his own actions, the woman who had been on the floor just moments ago stood taller than ever. Justice wasn't just coming. It was already here. But what would happen next? And just how deep did the corruption run? Because the real question wasn't whether the officer would pay for what he did. The real question was, who else was about to fall with him? At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism and discrimination in any form. This channel is a place where justice, truth, and powerful storytelling come together. To our Black viewers, your voice matters, your life matters, and we support you. Racism has no place here or anywhere in the world. Now, get ready for an intense and emotional story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support helps us create more impactful stories. Enjoy the story. The city of Atlanta hummed with life, its streets a mosaic of history, struggle, and resilience. The courthouse, an imposing structure of cold gray stone and towering columns, stood as a symbol of justice, though for many, that promise felt hollow. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and stale coffee, the low murmur of legal proceedings echoing through the halls. It was the kind of place where lives were decided, where power was wielded with a pen or a gavel, or, in some cases, with something far more dangerous. Agent Naomi Carter had walked into this very building hundreds of times before, but today, something was different. There was an edge to the atmosphere, a tension that seemed to pulse beneath the surface. She wasn't here as an observer or a silent force in the background. Today, she was here as the woman who had the power to expose everything. She had spent years in the FBI, rising through the ranks with relentless determination, her reputation built on discipline, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to justice. But none of that mattered to Officer Darren Mitchell. Darren Mitchell had spent his career as a police officer operating under a different set of rules, ones that he believed applied only to people like him, white, powerful, untouchable. His record was littered with misconduct reports, but they had always disappeared, buried under bureaucracy and the silent agreements that protected men like him. He had learned long ago that fear was his most effective weapon. A baton, a taser, a gun, these were just tools. Real power was knowing that no one would stop him. He had seen Naomi Carter before, but he hadn't cared to learn her name. To him, she was just another black woman who thought she could stand on equal ground. And that? That was something he couldn't tolerate. So when he saw her standing in the middle of the courtroom, unshaken, unwavering, his blood boiled. The case being presented today was nothing special, not in his eyes. Another black man falsely accused, another day where Darren had to sit and watch people pretend that justice was blind. He didn't care about guilt or innocence. He cared about control. And when he saw Naomi, her stance confident, her voice steady as she questioned the integrity of the police force, he felt something inside him snap. Her presence in that courtroom wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an insult. It was a challenge to everything he had built, everything he had enforced through fear. And he had never been one to let a challenge go unanswered. Naomi had known men like Darren her entire life. She had grown up watching them patrol her neighborhood, their hands always resting near their holsters, their eyes scanning for trouble that didn't exist. She had spent years dismantling their cases, exposing their lies, bringing them to justice one by one. But none of that changed the fact that every time she walked into a room like this, she had to prove herself all over again. She felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, some watching with quiet support, others with barely concealed contempt. And then there were the ones like Darren, men who saw her as a threat simply because she refused to be afraid of them. Darren's fingers twitched at his side, his grip tightening around the handle of his taser. He wasn't thinking anymore, he was reacting. The rage inside him was cold and sharp, years of unchecked power whispering in his ear, telling him he could do whatever he wanted and walk away untouched. The second the prongs hit Naomi's skin, she felt the jolt tear through her muscles, locking her joints in place as white-hot pain seared through her body. The room erupted in gasps, the judge's voice a distant roar as he banged his gavel. Naomi hit the floor hard, her breath ripping from her lungs, but she didn't close her eyes. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Darren stood over her, his smirk twisted with satisfaction, the taser still crackling in his grip. The silence in the room was suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. But Darren didn't feel the pressure. He felt untouchable. And then Naomi spoke. The words, "I'm FBI," didn't just hang in the air, they detonated. The shift in the room was instantaneous. Gasps turned into murmurs, fear turned into disbelief. The judge's expression flickered from outrage to shock, and Darren's smirk faltered, his mind racing to process what he had just done. Naomi pushed herself up, ignoring the lingering tremors in her limbs, her eyes locked onto his. She saw it now, the moment realization dawned on him. The panic in his eyes, the sweat forming at his temples. She had seen men like him crumble before. But this time, she wasn't just watching. She was the reason it was happening. The courtroom doors flew open, and suddenly, Darren wasn't the one in control anymore. Agents flooded the room, their movements precise, their expressions unreadable. Naomi didn't have to look to know what was happening next. Darren had spent years believing he could do anything, hurt anyone, and walk away without consequence. But today, that changed. Today, he was the one who would be judged. The air inside the courthouse had shifted. It was subtle at first, like the moment before a storm when the wind stills and the sky darkens, warning of what's to come. Darren Mitchell felt it creeping into his skin, an unease that he couldn't shake. The moment Naomi Carter had uttered those words, "I'm FBI," the very foundation of his arrogance had cracked. It was supposed to be just another day, another moment where his authority went unchallenged, where fear kept everyone in line. But now, the balance had tipped, and for the first time in his career, he was on the wrong side of it. Naomi had risen to her feet, slow and deliberate, shaking off the pain still lingering in her muscles. She didn't look shaken. She didn't look afraid. She looked like a woman who had just laid a trap and watched her prey walk right into it. Darren had expected compliance, submission, a lesson taught through force. Instead, he had made a fatal mistake. The weight of his own recklessness was beginning to settle on him, suffocating, pressing against his chest with every second that passed. Judge Holloway, a man whose patience had already been worn thin by the officer's behavior, slammed his gavel down so hard that the sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. His face was flushed with fury, his eyes burning with a rare kind of disgust that wasn't just about what had happened, it was about the years of knowing, of witnessing, of being forced to sit in a system that let men like Darren flourish. "Officer Mitchell, have you lost your damn mind?" the judge bellowed, rising to his feet, his voice a sharp blade cutting through the courtroom's stunned silence. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Darren opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The arrogance that usually coated his words had evaporated. He searched the room, looking for support, for allies, but found only vacant stares and a growing sense of isolation. Even the other officers in the room, men who had once laughed at his crude jokes and shared his contempt for people like Naomi, were backing away, suddenly unwilling to be associated with the disaster unfolding before them. Naomi stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with a restrained fury. "You assaulted a federal agent in the middle of a courthouse, in front of witnesses, including a sitting judge. Do you even understand what that means?" Darren swallowed hard, his tongue dry as sandpaper. His mind was screaming at him to fight back, to assert control, to find a way out. That's what he had always done. He had twisted stories, planted evidence, leaned on the shield of his badge whenever things got messy. But this was different. He wasn't dealing with some scared civilian who could be intimidated into silence. Naomi Carter was a force he had underestimated, and now, the ground beneath him was crumbling. A commotion near the entrance of the courtroom made his stomach tighten. Several FBI agents were pushing through the doors, their presence alone enough to turn the atmosphere suffocating. They weren't moving with urgency, no guns drawn, no chaos, just the slow, deliberate pace of men who already knew how this was going to end. Agent Jonathan Reyes, a man known for his icy composure and lethal efficiency, stepped forward, pulling out his badge with a casual flick of his wrist. He barely spared Darren a glance before shifting his attention to Naomi, his expression unreadable. "Agent Carter," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "are you hurt?" Naomi nodded once, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'll be fine. But I want him in custody now." Darren felt a cold sweat break out along the back of his neck. "Wait, this is ridiculous. This is a misunderstanding." His voice cracked slightly, a desperation seeping in that he couldn't control. "She was being aggressive. I thought she was a threat." Judge Holloway let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "A threat? The only threat in this room is you, Officer Mitchell." He gestured towards the FBI agents, his tone clipped and final. "Get him out of my courtroom." Darren's pulse spiked. His survival instincts kicked in, urging him to move, to run, to fight back in any way possible. But even as his body tensed, the reality hit him like a brick to the chest. There was no way out. This wasn't a routine arrest where he could make a call and have things disappear. There would be no favors pulled, no files mysteriously lost, no corrupt superior to sweep it under the rug. Naomi watched as two agents stepped forward, gripping Darren by his arms. She could see the panic flickering in his eyes now, the realization that the world was no longer bending in his favor. She had seen that look before, the moment when men who believed themselves untouchable were forced to face the consequences of their actions. "Naomi," Darren said suddenly, his voice lower, almost pleading now. "Listen, we don't have to do this. Let's be reasonable." She tilted her head slightly, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Reasonable?" His jaw clenched. Look, I get it, all right. I went too far. But you and I both know how these things work. We can work something out. Just let me make a call." "We don't need to make this into some big," Naomi cut him off, her voice cold as steel. "Oh, it's already big, Darren. And it's about to get a whole lot bigger." Darren's lips parted, but no words came. The weight of inevitability was pressing down on him now, smothering him. As the agents began to lead him away, the courtroom erupted into noise, whispers, murmurs, the sound of people processing what they had just witnessed. But Naomi wasn't done yet. She turned, her eyes scanning the crowd, finding the faces of those who had been silent for too long. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice carrying through the room with quiet authority. "This is about every person who has been on the other end of men like him and been told to just accept it. That ends today." For a moment, the courtroom was silent. And then, somewhere in the crowd, someone started clapping. It was hesitant at first, but then another joined in. And another. Until the room was filled with the sound of hands coming together, an unspoken acknowledgement that something had changed. Darren was shoved through the doors, disappearing from sight, but Naomi knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Because Darren Mitchell wasn't the only one with dirty hands. And when she was finished, the entire system that had protected him for so long would be coming down with him. But the real question was, just how deep did the rot go? And who else was about to be exposed? Darren Mitchell sat in the interrogation room, his hands shackled to the cold metal table, his mind racing for a way out. The walls around him seemed to close in, the sterile white lights above casting harsh shadows across his face. The room was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock mounted on the wall, each second stretching longer than the last. His jaw was clenched so tightly that he could feel his own pulse throbbing at his temples. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years maneuvering through the system, learning exactly how to evade consequences. And yet, here he was, stripped of his badge, his gun, his authority, his power. The door creaked open, and Naomi Carter walked in with an air of control so firm that it made the room feel even smaller. She wasn't in a rush. She moved with the certainty of someone who had already won. She pulled out a chair across from him, sat down, and folded her hands neatly on the table. For a moment, she didn't say anything, letting the silence stretch between them like a noose tightening around his neck. Darren's eyes darted toward the two-way mirror behind her. He knew there were people watching, listening, analyzing his every move. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "This is a joke," he muttered, his voice a mix of forced confidence and underlying panic. "You think you can take me down over one bad moment in court?" Naomi arched a brow, her expression unreadable. "You think this is about what happened in that courtroom?" She let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. "Darren, if that was all this was about, you wouldn't be sitting in this chair right now." "No, see, that was just the beginning. That was the moment you finally exposed yourself in front of the wrong people." His fingers curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms. "I don't know what you think you have on me, but you and I both know how this works. You can make a big show out of this, parade me around in cuffs, but when the dust settles, I'll be out, and you'll be another name on a file, just like all the others who thought they could take me down." Naomi leaned forward slightly, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "You really believe that, don't you? That no matter what you do, no matter how many lives you ruin, the system will always protect you?" She tilted her head, studying him like he was an insect under a magnifying glass. "And you know what? You're not entirely wrong. The system was built for men like you. To shield you, to make sure you walk away untouched. But here's the thing about shields, Darren, they don't work when the attack is coming from the inside." He frowned, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What the hell are you talking about?" She let the silence drag for a moment before reaching into the folder she had brought with her. She slid a stack of documents across the table. "Recognize these?" Darren hesitated before looking down. The second his eyes scanned the first page, the blood drained from his face. They weren't just files. They were reports. Complaints. Internal investigations that had never seen the light of day. His name was splattered across every one of them, linked to falsified police reports, excessive force incidents, missing evidence, years' worth of dirt. His mouth went dry. "Where the hell did you get these?" Naomi sat back, crossing her arms. "You made a lot of enemies, Darren. Some of them in places you never even considered. And while you were busy bullying your way through your career, people were keeping records, waiting for the right moment. The truth is, you were never as untouchable as you thought." He scoffed, but it was weaker now. "So what? You think a pile of paper is enough to—" The door opened again, and this time, Agent Reyes stepped in, his presence like a final nail in the coffin. He placed a flash drive on the table between them. "It's not just paper, Mitchell. It's video. It's audio. It's testimony from people who were too afraid to speak up before, but now, they know you don't have a badge to hide behind." Darren's breath hitched. His mind raced through every moment, every time he had bent the rules, broken them, erased the evidence. He had been careful. He had made sure there were no loose ends. And yet, here they were. With proof. With witnesses. With enough to bury him. "You're bluffing," he muttered, but there was no strength behind the words. Naomi tilted her head, a slow smirk forming. "Are we?" She pulled out a small tablet, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it around. A grainy video began to play. The timestamp put it at 5 years ago. The setting was an interrogation room, just like this one, except the man in the chair wasn't Darren, it was a black teenager, barely old enough to have graduated high school. His face was bruised, his eyes swollen from what had clearly been hours of intimidation and violence. Then came the voice. Darren's voice. "You think anyone's gonna believe your word over mine?" The words sent a shock through Darren's body, like ice water pouring down his spine. He remembered that night. He remembered the fear in that boy's eyes, the way he had laughed at his pleading. He had been so certain, that nothing would ever come of it. Naomi let the video play for a few more seconds before pausing it. She didn't need to say anything. The weight of the evidence was suffocating enough. Darren swallowed hard, his throat dry, his palms clammy against the table. His mind screamed at him to find an out, to think of something, anything. But for the first time, there was nothing. No excuses. No fabricated stories. No backup waiting in the wings to save him. Reyes leaned down, his voice low and final. "You're done." Naomi didn't look away from Darren's face, watching as the last traces of defiance drained from his expression. "The question now," she said, her voice quieter, almost a whisper, "is how much damage you want to take on the way down." Darren's chest rose and fell in rapid succession. His heart pounded against his ribs. This was it. The moment he had always believed would never come. Naomi slid another paper toward him. "This is your chance to cooperate. Because trust me, Darren, the people you worked for. The ones who let you get away with this for so long. They won't protect you now. They'll let you burn to save themselves." His hands trembled as he stared at the document in front of him. A confession. A deal. Everything inside him screamed to resist. To fight. To refuse. But for the first time in his life, Darren Mitchell was completely and utterly powerless. Darren stared at the confession document, his fingers hovering over it, hesitant, trembling. His entire life had been spent believing in his own invincibility, in the shield that came with the badge he had so often abused. Now, stripped of that power, he was nothing but a man backed into a corner, surrounded by people who had waited years for this moment. His breath was uneven, his mind screaming for an escape, but there was none. Every route he had once used, fear, manipulation, brute force, had been cut off. The weight of the moment pressed on his chest like a concrete block, suffocating him. Naomi watched him, silent, unwavering. She had seen this before, the slow collapse of a man who had spent his life on the other side of justice. But Darren wasn't just any man. He was the kind of predator who had thrived in the cracks of the system, who had learned to weaponize it for his own benefit. And yet, here he was, frozen, realizing too late that the very structure that had protected him for years was now the one swallowing him whole. His throat was dry as he licked his lips, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what you're doing." Naomi let out a slow breath, tilting her head slightly. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm giving you a choice. Cooperate, give us the names, the files, the people who covered for you, and maybe, you'll have something left to hold on to. Or you can keep pretending that there's a way out of this and watch everything you built burn to the ground." Darren clenched his jaw, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling apart. "You think they'll let me talk? You think the people above me will let me walk away after this?" His eyes flicked toward the mirror, paranoia creeping into his voice. "They're watching. You know they're watching. I signed this, I'm dead before I make it to a cell." Naomi didn't blink. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you became their attack dog. You were useful to them, Darren. You did their dirty work, enforced their rules, buried the bodies, sometimes literally. But now, you're a liability. And you know how they deal with liabilities." Darren's breathing grew heavier, the reality sinking in deeper. He had spent years believing he was the hunter, the one with power, the one untouchable by the very laws he had sworn to uphold. Now, he was nothing but prey. Reyes leaned in, his voice a sharp contrast to Naomi's measured calm. "We already have enough to put you away for life. You know that. This deal. It's not for you. It's for us. It's to clean out the rest of the garbage still hiding in the department, the judges, the higher-ups, the politicians who made sure you and people like you never faced consequences. So don't get it twisted, this isn't mercy. This is an opportunity to drag them down with you, or to let them throw you to the wolves and pretend they had nothing to do with you." Darren swallowed hard, his gaze darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for an exit. His fingers curled around the pen, hesitating, his mind spinning. His whole life had been about control, losing it now was like losing the air in his lungs. You really think they'll let me walk after this? I tell you what you want, and what? I disappear. Witness protection. You think that's gonna stop them? Naomi's eyes never left his. I think you're out of options. Darren let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. You don't get it. You think this is justice? You think putting me in a cell changes anything? There's always gonna be another me. Another guy willing to do what needs to be done. You think taking me down changes the system? Naomi's voice was steady, unwavering. No. But it's a start. The words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent his career believing he was part of something bigger, that he was untouchable because he wasn't acting alone. But now, that same system was leaving him to rot. The people he had protected, the ones who had whispered reassurances when things got too messy, were silent. No calls. No lawyers rushing in. No lifelines. His grip on the pen tightened, his knuckles turning white. He could feel the sweat on his palms, the cold, sickening realization that no matter what he did next, his life as he knew it was over. He could take the deal and hope for protection, or he could sit in silence and let the people who had used him erase him from existence. His jaw clenched as he scrawled his name across the confession, the ink bleeding into the paper as if it were sealing his fate. He pushed it forward with a sharp motion, his eyes dark with resentment. There. You got what you wanted. Naomi exhaled, slow and controlled, before sliding the document off the table. She glanced at Reyes, who nodded, signaling for the guards waiting outside. Within seconds, the door opened, and 2 officers stepped in, their expressions unreadable. Take him to holding, Reyes instructed. Darren's chair scraped against the floor as he was pulled to his feet, his hands still cuffed. He didn't fight it, didn't resist. He had nothing left to hold on to. As he was led toward the door, he turned his head slightly, his voice lower now, almost unreadable. You really think you won? Naomi didn't blink. I think you lost. Darren let out another hollow laugh, shaking his head. Then you don't know how deep this goes. Naomi's expression didn't change, but something in her chest tightened. She had spent years dismantling corruption, chasing shadows in a system built to protect them. And Darren was right about one thing, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The walls of the federal holding facility were bare, stripped of any warmth, any sign of life. Darren Mitchell sat on the metal bench in his cell, his hands resting on his knees, his head tilted slightly downward. His face was expressionless, but his mind was a hurricane of thoughts, spinning with nowhere to go. Outside his cell, the sounds of distant conversations, the clanking of doors, and the occasional echo of footsteps filled the silence. The world was still moving, but for him, time had stopped. He had signed the confession, given them what they wanted. And now, all that was left was to wait for the fallout. He wasn't stupid, he knew what came next. The department would scramble, distancing itself from him, pretending he had been a rogue officer, an outlier, rather than a symptom of something larger. The people he had worked for, the ones who had let him operate unchecked, would act as if they had never known the depths of his corruption. Some would go into hiding, others would find new ways to bury the truth. And him? He was the perfect scapegoat. The price of their continued survival. His fingers curled into fists, his nails pressing against his palms. There had been a time when he had believed he was untouchable. That the badge on his chest meant more than just authority, it meant power, control, immunity. Now, he was just another criminal behind bars, waiting for the system he had once weaponized to decide his fate. Across the city, Naomi Carter sat at her desk, a stack of reports in front of her, her eyes scanning the names listed within them. The case against Darren was just the surface. The deeper she looked, the more rot she found. It wasn't just one officer, or one department, it was an entire network, a tangled mess of corruption that had gone unchecked for years. Darren had been a willing participant, but he had never been alone. She exhaled, rubbing her temples as she tried to process the weight of it all. The victory felt hollow. He was going to prison, but the machine that had protected him was still running. And if she knew anything about men like Darren, it was that they would do whatever it took to survive. A knock on her office door pulled her from her thoughts. Agent Reyes stepped inside, his expression grim. "We have a problem," he said, closing the door behind him. Mitchell's statement was enough to open investigations on several key figures, but we just got word, 2 of them are already gone. One disappeared. The other? Dead. Apparent suicide. Naomi's stomach tightened. It was starting. The cleanup. The people who had built their power on silence and fear weren't going to let this unravel without a fight. They were cutting loose ends, making sure no one else talked. And if Darren was next on that list, it meant they weren't just watching, they were already moving. Reyes leaned against the desk, arms crossed. He knows too much. If they decide he's a risk, he won't make it to trial. Naomi met his gaze, her mind racing. Then we need to move him. Now. Darren sat in his cell, staring at the concrete wall, when he heard the sound of approaching footsteps. 2 guards stopped in front of the bars, their expressions unreadable. One of them spoke, his voice flat. "Mitchell, on your feet. You're being transferred." Darren's eyes narrowed. "Transferred? To where?" The guard didn't answer, unlocking the door instead. "Let's go." Something felt off. The timeline didn't make sense, transfers weren't sudden like this. But he knew better than to argue. He stood, his mind working through the possibilities. Either this was legitimate, or it was something else. Something worse. As he was led through the corridors, his instincts screamed at him. Every shadow felt like a threat, every glance from passing officers held something he couldn't quite read. He wasn't safe. He knew that much. They reached the transport area, where a black SUV was waiting. One of the guards opened the door, motioning for him to get inside. He hesitated. Then, just as he was about to step forward, a voice cut through the air. "Stop right there." Naomi's voice carried with the kind of authority that made people listen. She and Reyes approached, their badges flashing, their eyes locked onto the 2 guards. "This transfer isn't happening," Reyes said, stepping in front of Darren. "You're not taking him anywhere." One of the guards frowned. "We have orders, from who?" Naomi interrupted, her tone sharp. "Because I just got off the phone with the warden, and he didn't authorize any transfer." The silence that followed was thick, heavy. Darren, for the first time in his life, felt what it was like to be on the other end of that kind of power. He saw the shift in the guards' expressions, the way their stance changed. They weren't law enforcement. They were something else. Naomi's voice dropped, quiet but laced with steel. "If you move him, you won't make it past the gate." The 2 men exchanged a glance. Then, without another word, they turned and walked away, disappearing down the corridor. Darren let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Naomi, his jaw tight. "They were going to kill me." Naomi didn't look away. "Yes. And they still might." For the first time since this had started, Darren understood. He wasn't just another case. He wasn't just a disgraced cop. He was a liability. And the people he had worked for, the ones who had made him feel invincible, were now hunting him. The system wasn't crumbling. It was fighting back. And the real war had only just begun. Darren Mitchell sat rigidly in the back of the armored transport vehicle, his wrists tightly bound by cold steel cuffs that dug into his skin with every slight movement. His entire body felt heavy, not just from the physical restraints but from the crushing weight of everything that had unraveled around him. His breathing was shallow, uneven, as if his own lungs refused to cooperate with the new reality settling in. Every beat of his pulse echoed like a countdown, a reminder that the power he had once held, the authority that had made him feel untouchable, was gone. He had spent years believing he was on the right side of the law, or at least convincing himself that he was. Now, as he sat there in silence, stripped of his badge, stripped of his influence, stripped of the arrogance that had once defined him, he was finally forced to face the truth. He had never been untouchable. He had only been protected. And now, that protection had vanished, and he was just another prisoner waiting for his sentence to be decided by forces beyond his control. Across from him, Naomi Carter remained motionless, her dark eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his stomach twist. There was something about the way she looked at him, calm, unwavering, unreadable. She wasn't gloating, wasn't reveling in the fact that she had torn him down. She had already won. They both knew it. But her silence, her unwavering presence, made it clear that this was far from over. Darren clenched his fists in his lap, his fingers curling into the fabric of his prison-issued jumpsuit. He could feel the tension radiating off of her, not anger, but something else. Determination. He forced out a bitter chuckle, though there was no amusement behind it. "They're not going to stop, you know." His voice was low, rasping with exhaustion, but there was an unmistakable thread of fear beneath it. Naomi didn't even blink. "No. They're not." Darren exhaled, shaking his head slowly. "You think you've won something here? You think locking me up, putting my name on the news, dragging me through the mud is going to change anything?" His voice took on a hard edge, a last, desperate grasp at the confidence he used to carry. "This machine is bigger than you, Carter. Bigger than me. You put me away, and they'll find another guy just like me to take my place. They'll clean up the mess, patch the holes, and by next year, it'll be like none of this ever happened." Naomi tilted her head slightly, a slow exhale leaving her lips as she studied him. "Maybe," she admitted, her voice even, controlled. "But you won't be there to enjoy it." Darren's jaw clenched so hard it ached, a muscle twitching near his temple as he let her words sink in. He had no leverage left, nothing to threaten her with, nothing to use as a shield. Naomi wasn't afraid of him, wasn't afraid of what he represented. He could feel the walls closing in, suffocating him, and for the first time in his life, he was the one trapped with no way out. The silence between them stretched, thick with everything that had been left unsaid. Agent Jonathan Reyes, seated in the passenger seat at the front of the vehicle, turned his head slightly toward the back, his sharp gaze flickering between Darren and Naomi through the reflection of the rearview mirror. "We're not just putting you away, Mitchell," he said, his voice edged with a cold finality. "We're exposing everything. Every name you scrubbed from reports, every case you buried, every innocent person who suffered because you and your friends thought you could play God." Darren scoffed, but even he could hear the weakness in his own voice. "You really think people care? You really think the public gives a damn about any of this? About you?" He let out another hollow laugh, shaking his head. "You act like this is some kind of reckoning, like the world is finally waking up. But they're not. People don't care, Carter. They don't care unless it happens to them. And even then, they move on. You think they'll riot in the streets for people like you? For people like the ones I put away?" Naomi didn't flinch, didn't so much as shift in her seat. Instead, she leaned forward, just slightly, her voice cutting through the thick air like a blade. "They don't have to riot," she said, her tone sharper than steel. "They just have to know." Darren's pulse quickened, an unspoken fear crawling up his spine. He had spent his entire career ensuring that the truth never reached the surface. He had seen what happened when people started asking questions, when they started digging too deep. His entire existence had been built around keeping the truth buried. That was what real power was, not just controlling people, but controlling what they believed. What they knew. And now, Naomi Carter was ripping that power away from him. The armored SUV took a sharp turn, the tires skidding against the wet asphalt. Outside, the city was a blur of neon lights, flickering street lamps, and the dark silhouettes of buildings towering against the storm-heavy sky. Darren's instincts, dulled by years of believing he was above consequence, suddenly flared back to life. Something was wrong. Reyes' phone vibrated against the dashboard. He picked it up, his face darkening as he scanned the screen. Without hesitation, he turned to Naomi. "We have a problem." Naomi stiffened, her body going rigid. "What is it?" Reyes handed her the phone, his voice low and clipped. "Federal holding facility is on lockdown. Security breach. Someone tried to get in." The weight of those words settled in the air like a stone dropping into water. Naomi's grip tightened around the phone, her mind already racing ahead, already piecing together the puzzle before the final picture was even revealed. Darren swallowed hard, his heartbeat thudding against his ribs. "They're still coming for me." His voice was quieter now, less arrogant, less certain. Naomi didn't look away from the phone screen. "No," she murmured. "They're coming for the truth." The driver's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ma'am, we need to change routes. We can't go back to the safe house. If they're bold enough to hit a federal holding facility, they already know where we were taking him." Reyes muttered a curse under his breath. How the hell did they get intel this fast? Darren exhaled sharply, a grim smile twisting at the corner of his lips. "You still don't get it, do you?" He turned his head slightly, eyes meeting Naomi's with something that almost resembled pity. "You think I'm the only one in danger? You think they won't come for you, too?" Naomi's expression remained unreadable, but deep in her chest, something tightened. She had spent her career pulling at the threads of corruption, dismantling it piece by piece. But this wasn't a single bad cop, a single department. This was an entire machine, one that had been running long before she had stepped onto the playing field. Reyes pressed a hand to his earpiece, listening intently before cursing again. "We need a new location. Somewhere off-grid. No digital trail, no paper records." Darren let out another bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You really think hiding me is going to fix this? You think keeping me alive changes anything? They'll find me. They'll find you. This isn't a fight you can win." Naomi leaned forward again, her eyes dark, unwavering. "Then I guess we'll just have to fight harder." Outside, the city stretched ahead of them, dark and restless beneath the storm rolling in. The vehicle sped through the night, its headlights cutting through the rain as they raced toward an uncertain future. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The rain hit the windshield in relentless sheets, the rhythmic pounding matching the pulse hammering in Darren Mitchell's ears. The armored SUV sped through the city's outskirts, weaving between dimly lit streets and disappearing into the shadows cast by towering overpasses. Inside the vehicle, the tension was suffocating, thick with unspoken truths and the weight of impending danger. The walls were closing in, and everyone inside knew it. Darren shifted slightly, his wrists still bound in steel cuffs, the cold bite of metal pressing into his skin a constant reminder of his reality. He had gone from being a man who dictated fear to a man who now lived in it. The silence in the car was too loud, pressing in on him, suffocating him with every mile they put between themselves and whatever was coming for them. Naomi Carter sat motionless across from him, her arms crossed, her jaw clenched. She wasn't looking at him, her gaze was fixed beyond him, staring out the rain-speckled window as if she could see something coming that no one else could. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction. She had won, but it didn't feel like victory. Not when the system she was fighting against was still very much alive, still hunting, still desperate to silence the truth. Reyes kept his eyes locked on his phone, his fingers moving rapidly as he pulled up reports, communications, whatever scraps of information he could find. His face was set in hard lines, his usual composure stretched thin under the weight of what they had just learned. "We can't outrun this," he muttered finally, his voice barely audible over the hum of the tires against the wet pavement. "They're moving faster than we expected. That lockdown at the holding facility? That wasn't just about getting to Mitchell. It was a message. They're not trying to cover their tracks anymore. They're making a statement." Darren exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're acting like this is new. Like they haven't been doing this for years." His voice was raw, edged with something close to exhaustion. "You really think exposing me is going to change anything? I was a tool. A pawn. And now that I'm useless, they'll erase me. And when I'm gone, someone else will take my place, and this cycle will keep turning, just like it always has." Naomi finally looked at him then, her eyes sharp, unwavering. "Not if we break it." Darren let out a dry, humorless laugh, his head tilting back against the seat. "You think you're the first person who's tried?" He turned his head to meet her gaze, his expression twisted in something between bitterness and resignation. "You don't dismantle something like this. You don't expose it and expect justice to come rolling in. These people don't just have power. They are power. They built the laws that protect them. They decide who wins and who loses before the game even starts. And right now? You might think you're ahead, but trust me, Carter, you're just playing into their hands." Naomi didn't blink. "If that were true, they wouldn't be trying so hard to kill you." That shut him up. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against the tightness in his throat. He had been trying to convince himself that he was already dead, that fighting was pointless, that survival was nothing more than delaying the inevitable. But the truth was, he was still here. Still breathing. And they were still afraid of what he might say. Reyes' phone buzzed again, and whatever was on the screen made his entire body go rigid. His fingers tightened around the device, his jaw clenching as he read the message once, then again, as if hoping the words would change. "It's worse than we thought," he said, his voice tight, controlled. "Someone leaked the transport details. There's chatter on the dark web, people offering bounties, promising cash for whoever can take Mitchell out before he reaches trial." Darren's stomach dropped. He had expected the people in power to come for him. He had expected the system to bury him before he could talk. But this? This was different. This wasn't just an execution order from the top. This was the world turning against him. Every desperate lowlife, every opportunistic hitman, every corrupt cop who wanted to get back into the good graces of their superiors, any one of them could be out there right now, waiting for their chance. Naomi's grip tightened on the seat. "Then we change the plan. We don't go to the original safe house. We don't follow protocol. We disappear." Reyes frowned. "And go where? There's nowhere safe. They have eyes everywhere." Naomi's mind was already moving, already searching for the one place they wouldn't expect. Then, like a puzzle piece clicking into place, the answer came. "We go underground." Reyes blinked. "What?" "We take him off the grid. No paper trail. No communication. No digital footprint." Naomi's voice was steady, resolute. "If they can't find him, they can't kill him." Darren let out a harsh breath, shaking his head. "And then what? I just live like a ghost for the rest of my life?" Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "Or you live long enough to make sure they never do this to anyone else again." The weight of her words settled heavily over the space between them. Darren stared at her, something flickering in his eyes that he didn't want to acknowledge. Hope. No. He had killed that part of himself a long time ago. But something about the way she said it, like she actually believed it, made him wonder. Reyes inhaled deeply, rubbing a hand down his face. "This is insane. Even if we pull it off, it's temporary at best. They'll never stop looking." Naomi's voice was quiet but firm. "Then we make sure they're too busy running from their own crimes to come after us." Reyes exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You're really willing to burn it all down, aren't you? Naomi met his gaze. If that's what it takes. Darren looked between them, something shifting in his chest, something he didn't quite understand. He had spent his whole life believing in power, in control, in the certainty that people like Naomi lost because the game had been rigged from the start. But now, looking at her, at Reyes, at the way they refused to back down even when everything was stacked against them, he realized something. Maybe the game wasn't rigged. Maybe it was just finally breaking apart. The vehicle sped down an empty backroad, the rain pounding harder, the night stretching ahead of them like a road with no clear end. The storm wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The safe house was deep in the countryside, a place so far removed from the chaos of the city that it felt like another world entirely. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and humid, the scent of damp earth clinging to everything. The old wooden cabin was unassuming, hidden away in dense trees, a place forgotten by time. Inside, the tension sat between them like an unwelcome guest. The weight of everything that had happened, everything that was still happening, loomed over them like an approaching storm. Darren Mitchell sat at the worn wooden table, his cuffs finally removed, his wrists bearing the red marks of restraint. He hadn't spoken much since they arrived. He just sat there, staring at nothing, his mind caught in the tangled mess of his past and the unknown shape of his future. Naomi Carter stood near the window, her arms crossed, her body rigid with the exhaustion she refused to acknowledge. The adrenaline had finally begun to wear off, leaving behind the ache of too many battles fought in too little time. But she couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. They had bought themselves time, but that was all it was, borrowed time, ticking away with every passing second. Agent Reyes was outside, securing the perimeter, making calls, ensuring that no one had followed them. He was the only one among them who still had an official identity, a life he could return to when this was all over. If it ever was. Darren finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse, worn down to something unfamiliar. You really think this is gonna change anything? He didn't sound defiant anymore. He sounded tired, drained of the arrogance that had once fueled him. You think taking me off the board makes a difference? Naomi turned from the window, her eyes locking onto his. It's not about you, Mitchell. It never was. You were just one piece of the problem. You were never the end goal. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. So what? You're gonna keep going. Keep chasing ghosts until there's nothing left of you. She didn't hesitate. If that's what it takes. Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of something he didn't want to acknowledge. Darren had spent his entire life believing in power, the kind that came from control, from fear, from knowing that the system was built to protect him. But now, looking at Naomi, he saw a different kind of power. One that didn't come from dominance, but from resilience. From refusing to back down, even when the fight seemed impossible. Reyes stepped inside, his face unreadable as he shut the door behind him. It's done, he said, his voice clipped. The files are out. Every piece of evidence, every name, every connection. It's all out there now. The media has it. The watchdog groups have it. Some of the biggest players are already trying to distance themselves. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. There's no taking it back. Darren's stomach twisted. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way he wasn't prepared for. So what happens now? Naomi's gaze didn't waver. Now, we see who burns first. The next 48 hours were chaos. The revelations hit the news like a detonation, sending shockwaves through the entire system. Protests erupted across the country. Officials scrambled to contain the fallout, to minimize the damage, to find someone, anyone, to take the blame. More arrests followed. Names Darren had worked under, names he had taken orders from, were suddenly being dragged into the light. And then, the final blow came. A press conference. The chief of police, the mayor, high-ranking officials, all standing at a podium, their faces set in carefully measured expressions. The words they spoke were the same ones the public had heard before, the same tired rhetoric, the same empty promises of reform. But this time, the public wasn't listening. They were watching. Watching as, behind the polished speeches, the walls of the system began to crack. Darren Mitchell was formally indicted. His charges were extensive: corruption, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, assault. His face was everywhere. The man who had once believed himself untouchable was now the face of everything the public had been told didn't exist. He had been sacrificed, just as Naomi had predicted. But it wasn't enough. More names were exposed. More investigations opened. The machine that had protected Darren for so long was now consuming itself, trying to survive. Some ran. Some cut deals. Some went down fighting. But the tide had shifted, and for the first time in his life, Darren wasn't on the winning side. He watched it all from a distance, hidden away, a ghost of the man he had once been. His only choice had been exile or death, and Naomi had made the decision for him. He would live, but he would never be free. His name was poison. His face was a warning. He could never walk in the world he had once ruled. He would spend the rest of his days looking over his shoulder, knowing that the people he had once called allies wanted him dead more than anyone else. Naomi Carter, on the other hand, did not hide. She stood at the front of the storm, shoulders squared, head held high. She had done what they said couldn't be done. She had cracked the foundation. And though the war was far from over, she had proven one thing: justice wasn't impossible. It was just waiting for someone willing to fight for it. Now, let me ask you, what would you have done in Naomi's place? Would you have kept fighting, knowing that the system you were up against was designed to destroy you? Would you have taken the risk? Or would you have walked away, knowing the fight might never end? Because the truth is, this isn't just a story. This is reality. Corruption exists because people believe they can get away with it. But what happens when they can't? What happens when enough people stand up and say, no more? The fight doesn't end here. It never does. But if there's one thing this story should remind you of, it's this: the truth has power. And the only way they win is if we stay silent. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. We tell the stories that need to be told. The ones that shake you, that challenge you, that stay with you. Because the world isn't just black and white. It's full of twists. And sometimes, justice comes in the most unexpected ways.